In an unprecedented global broadcast, the Pope erupts in fury during a live interview, calling out a rising American political star over her faith. What unfolds next will rattle the pillars of religion, media, and power, culminating in a challenge that shocks the world. The air was thick with anticipation. Millions tuned in worldwide, expecting a rare, tempered conversation with Pope Francis, a spiritual reflection, perhaps a political insight or two. What they got instead was something no one could have predicted. Set in a sleek Roman broadcast studio, bathed in soft white light, and guarded by layers of Vatican security, the stage was serene. Cameras rolled. The world watched. And the Pope, usually calm, composed, and deliberate in his public persona, sat poised in his chair. But there was a crackle of tension behind his eyes that no lighting could disguise. The interviewer, a seasoned Italian journalist known for walking the line between reverence and confrontation, guided the conversation through expected currents. Global unrest, rising atheism, the politicization of religion. Then, the conversation shifted. The mention of Karoline Leavitt, the young meteoric figure rising through American politics, set something off. Her name hadn't even fully left the interviewer's mouth when the Pope leaned forward, unblinking, his voice cutting through the room like glass shattering on marble. His words were not measured. They were fiery, confrontational, direct. He accused Karoline of desecrating sacred symbols, using the cross that hung around her neck not as a token of devotion, but as a calculated ploy to court the American heartland. He called her charm dangerous, her smile misleading, her words empty of true understanding. And then, more startlingly, he declared she had no Christian roots at all, an opportunist, not a believer. The studio froze. Even the crew dropped their heads, unsure whether to keep filming. The interviewer tried to intervene, but the Pope didn't stop. Instead, he doubled down. He demanded proof of her faith. He claimed that if she truly sought to wear the cross, to invoke the name of God in speeches, in policies, in her public image, then she must submit to divine scrutiny. And his terms? Baptism. Public. Televised. Administered by him. Only then, he argued, would her words carry the weight of spiritual truth. The broadcast ended in chaos. Some Vatican officials attempted to spin it, suggesting the Pope had been misinterpreted or perhaps agitated due to age or fatigue. But the damage was done. Clips flooded social media within minutes. The outrage was global. Millions debated, had the Pope just issued a public challenge to a political figure over the legitimacy of her soul? Karoline Leavitt herself had remained quiet through the first night. No tweets, no press statements. Her team offered only a terse, no comment, fueling further speculation. But insiders whispered that she'd been blindsided and that something was coming. By morning, every media outlet in the West had its cameras turned toward her. Pundits argued endlessly. Was this the unraveling of the Church's neutrality? A new era of political persecution from the pulpit? Or was there truth buried in the Pope's fury? That night, Karoline finally appeared. An exclusive, one-on-one interview streamed globally, framed by dim lighting and minimalist decor. No flashing lights, no dramatic music. Just her. Alone. Composed. A stark contrast to the fury that had been unleashed upon her. She didn't attack. She didn't falter. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. She told the story the world didn't know. Raised in a fragmented household, with no structured religious upbringing, Karoline described a girl who once stood on the edge. She spoke of quiet despair, self-doubt, and the crushing pressure of identity that came with growing up in a world demanding answers she didn't have. The turning point wasn't a preacher or a church. It was a Bible, left behind in a dusty public library in a town she didn't even remember. She found it by accident. She read it in secret. Not to impress anyone. Not to gain votes. but because the words felt like water to someone who didn't know she was dying of thirst. She described how those words stitched her broken identity together piece by piece. She didn't find God in a cathedral. She found him in silence, in loneliness, in the fire of becoming, and still she didn't lash out at the Pope. She thanked him, not with sarcasm, but with something deeper, because his outrage had given her a stage to tell the truth of her faith. A stage she never asked for, but would now not waste. Then came the twist. She accepted his challenge. She would be baptized, publicly, before the world. But under one condition: it must be Pope Francis himself who did it. If he truly questioned her devotion, then he should stand face to face with her and see it for himself, not behind Vatican walls, not in cloisters or closed doors, but under the eye of the people. The interviewer was speechless. Social media exploded. In every comment thread, every headline, one question repeated itself like a drumbeat. Would the Pope follow through? The world watched, waiting. But while most expected silence or a backpedal from the Vatican, what came next only fanned the flames further. By the following afternoon, a crimson-sealed letter emerged from the Apostolic Palace. A formal statement, its gold-trimmed edges glinting as it was read aloud by the Vatican's official spokesperson on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, under the heavy Roman sun. In a voice calm yet coldly resolute, the spokesperson confirmed what no one truly believed would happen. The Pope accepted her condition. Pope Francis would baptize Karoline Leavitt, live, global, personal. But his words carried weight, cut with the same fiery skepticism that ignited the storm. The Vatican made clear this baptism would not be a political spectacle, nor a surrender to public relations. It would be, in their words, a test of spirit, a divine reckoning. The waters of baptism cleanse only that which is honest. The final line read, "Let the world watch, and let heaven judge." And with that, the tone was set. This would not be an olive branch. It would be a confrontation dressed as a ceremony. In America, Karoline's team scrambled. Public support had unexpectedly surged, following her emotional interview. But now things were shifting. Religious leaders debated her intentions. Political opponents sharpened their knives. The idea of a politician, young, ambitious, female, standing before the Pope to defend her faith felt like a paradox wrapped in a performance. Was this authentic, or calculated brilliance? Inside Karoline's inner circle, chaos brewed. Advisors urged her to delay, to negotiate, to withdraw under the guise of reflection. But Karoline, sitting in a quiet Washington, D.C. office overlooking the Jefferson Memorial, refused. Her mind was made. She'd felt the wave of momentum not as fame, but as responsibility. 2 days later, she was on a plane bound for Rome. The flight was quiet. No entourage, no press. Just her and a singular item tucked inside her coat. The same weathered Bible she'd found as a teenager. Its pages now softened by time and handling, passages underlined in blue ink, with corners dog-eared and frayed as the plane descended into Fiumicino. The city of Rome stretched beneath her like a sleeping lion, ancient, magnificent, and dangerous in its memory. The Vatican had never baptized a modern politician under global view, not once, and certainly not one accused so publicly by the Pope himself. The next morning, the world stopped. It was an event unlike any before it. Broadcast across every major network, streamed on every platform, the setup was stark. A simple baptismal font placed in the Sistine Chapel, with its Michelangelo-painted ceiling looming like the eye of history itself. 2 cameras, no audience, only sacred silence, and the sound of global breath being held. Karoline entered wearing plain white, no jewelry, no makeup. Her cross necklace, absent. She wanted nothing between her and the truth. Pope Francis stood already by the font. Robes, heavy, face unreadable. No words were exchanged at first, only the quiet echo of footsteps across marble. Then he raised his eyes. What followed was not gentle. Before the baptism could proceed, the Pope addressed her directly, not in private, but aloud, for the world to hear. He asked her, point blank, to account for her faith again, not through anecdotes or prepared statements, but by reciting, from memory, the Gospel of John's opening lines. Not a test of theology, but conviction. His voice, though not raised, was ironclad with scrutiny. Karoline did not falter. Her voice echoed under the frescoes with the words she'd first read as a lonely girl in a silent library. In the beginning was the Word. As she continued, her eyes did not leave his. There was no trembling, no performance, only belief. Then came the final step. She approached the font, and Pope Francis, with a hand raised over her head, paused. He looked down, for the first time seeming to hesitate. Not from doubt, but from realization. The moment had changed. The fire he'd ignited had become something else. Not submission, not spectacle, but an unstoppable statement of resilience. The water poured. The world watched as Karoline Leavitt was baptized by the Pope himself. It should have ended there, but it didn't, because as she rose, drenched and solemn, the Pope leaned in. His words, not captured by any mic but later repeated by Vatican aides, were brief and chilling. He told her this was only the beginning, and then he turned and walked away. The ceremony was over, but the conflict had only deepened. Within hours, reaction poured in. Conservative groups hailed Karoline as a modern Joan of Arc. Progressive leaders accused the Church of exploiting her. Religious scholars dissected every gesture, every pause, every drop of water. But the most unnerving reaction came from within the Vatican walls themselves. High-ranking bishops, speaking under anonymity, expressed confusion. Some admitted they feared the Pope had crossed an unspoken line, that this baptism, framed in confrontation, had turned into a referendum on who controls faith in the 21st century. And Karoline, she remained in Rome that night, alone in a nondescript hotel near the Tiber River. No interviews, no press, only the Bible again in her hands, now damp from ceremony. But something else happened that night, something that didn't make headlines. A letter slid under her door in silence, bearing no seal. Just a handwritten note. "They will not stop here. Prepare yourself." The handwriting was old, sharp, and not the Pope's. Somewhere in the city, unseen and unheard, shadows were moving. Not everyone believed her baptism was genuine, and worse, some saw it as a threat to their hold on something far more dangerous than politics. The narrative of belief itself. And as dawn approached, it was no longer a question of faith. It was a matter of power. The baptism had made her a symbol, but symbols are dangerous when they start to move on their own. Within hours of the ceremony, Vatican corridors buzzed with whispers sharper than any sermon. Papal aides exchanged wary glances. Cardinals huddled behind closed doors, and in the deepest recesses of the Curia, ancient alliances began to stir. Something had shifted, and not in the direction they expected. Pope Francis, for all his authority, had opened a door that couldn't be shut. Karoline Leavitt, the American politician who'd stood accused of faithless theatrics, had stood before the world and stared down centuries of ecclesiastical weight without blinking. The optics were undeniable. To the faithful, she was courage, clothed in humility. To skeptics, she was disruption incarnate. But to the powerful, both sacred and secular, she was now a variable too volatile to control. The letter she received that night, the one slipped under her hotel door without seal or sender, haunted her thoughts as Rome awoke the next morning. "They will not stop here. Prepare yourself." It wasn't a warning. It was a promise, and she believed it. Karoline remained silent for the next 24 hours, refusing all interview requests, issuing no statements. Her team was rattled. They didn't understand her calm, but they followed her lead. Behind her composed exterior, however, something deeper churned. She had walked into Rome expecting to defend her belief. What she hadn't anticipated was the full weight of the institution, its politics, its secrets, and its ancient ability to reshape truth with silence. But it was too late for silence now. The next evening, a new thread emerged. A leak, an anonymous email hit 3 international newsrooms within minutes of each other. Its contents? A series of internal Vatican memos, some authentic, others altered, hinting at a coordinated effort to discredit Karoline in the days leading up to the Pope's outburst. The implication was clear. She hadn't been a spontaneous target. She'd been marked. While major networks hesitated to publish without verification, one independent journalist, Matteo Ricci, did not wait. Ricci, a veteran war correspondent, turned political investigator, published the leak in full on his web-based outlet. The story exploded. Among the documents was a redacted profile labeled Sub J. Leavitt, K. Its contents cold and bureaucratic. It outlined not just her public image, but her private life, family ties, old boyfriends, early voting records, psychological evaluations. Deep surveillance, the kind not gathered overnight. More disturbingly, the leak included a document titled, simply, Operation Veil. It laid out a strategy, indirect, sophisticated, to force Karoline into a spiritual corner, to call into question her credibility through moral scrutiny. Not a smear campaign, a purification by public pressure. One line stood out, circled in faded pen. If she claims the cross, she must bleed for it. The Vatican dismissed the leak as forged slander. But the timing was damning. Public opinion tilted again. This wasn't about faith anymore. It was about control. In Rome, Karoline held her silence, until she didn't. 2 nights after the leak, she held a press conference, unannounced, unadorned, streamed live from the steps of a small chapel outside the Vatican walls. She wore black, no makeup, no political banners behind her. Just the Bible. Always the Bible. She didn't call out the Pope, not directly, but she didn't have to. Her words, steady as a chisel to stone, cut through the noise. Faith is not a stage, and I will not ask for permission to believe in the God who found me before I ever found him. The final sentence turned the air to ice. If the Church sees belief as a threat, then maybe it is the Church that needs redemption. Gasps echoed across continents. The press scrambled. Pundits howled. The Vatican, for the first time in years, issued no immediate response. Inside the Holy See, however, fury erupted. That same night, a conclave of senior cardinals convened under an emergency protocol not seen since the early 2000s. Pope Francis, absent from the first half of the meeting, arrived late and alone. The debate was fierce. Some believed the Church had overstepped. Others believed the Pope had gone soft. And one, Cardinal Mancini, a traditionalist with quiet influence, voiced what others only thought. He called Karoline dangerous, a martyr without the death, a voice without the leash, and worst of all, untouchable now, wrapped in the glow of viral virtue. But even as the Vatican strategized, a different battle had begun elsewhere. In Washington, a rising senator demanded a formal inquiry into potential international religious coercion against an American citizen. Another congresswoman called the events spiritual warfare dressed in ritual. Online, the divide deepened. Hashtags surged. People were choosing sides, not between church and state, but between obedience and authenticity. Karoline watched it all unfold from a rooftop garden overlooking the Vatican. She was tired, yes, but not afraid. The baptism had been a beginning, not an end. And somewhere deep in her bones, she knew the fire wasn't meant to destroy her. It was meant to refine her. But the next blow wouldn't come from Rome. It came from home. Back in New Hampshire, her childhood town's local paper ran a story from a former neighbor, a quiet woman in her 70s, claiming Karoline had once renounced religion altogether during high school, even mocking Christians in private conversations. The headline was brutal. From doubt to deception. Is Karoline Leavitt's faith manufactured? Photos surfaced. Old yearbook quotes. A blurry photo of a teenage Karoline holding a separation of church and state sign at a protest no one remembered. The press circled like vultures. Suddenly, belief had a timeline, and Karoline's past, long buried and half forgotten, was being unearthed to challenge her very soul. But the question now wasn't whether she believed. It was whether the world would believe her. The narrative was shifting again, but this time it wasn't in Karoline's favor. The yearbook photo, the neighbor's account, the resurfaced footage of a teenage protest, none of it could be outright denied. It was her. She had been there. She had said those things. But what they didn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to, was that faith isn't born in a vacuum. It's forged in contradiction, in questions, in the mess. That nuance didn't translate well to headlines. Networks latched onto the story like wolves with fresh blood. Overnight, news anchors went from praising her poise to dissecting her conversion arc. Panels of theologians, psychologists, and political analysts debated whether someone with such an inconsistent past could ever be considered a true believer, or whether she was, as some now said, simply a master manipulator, bending religion to her advantage. The term faith fraud began trending. Karoline issued no response for 3 days. Her team begged her to speak up, to clarify, to push back. But she waited. Not out of weakness, out of calculation. The Vatican remained publicly silent, but privately their claws had extended. An anonymous source from inside the Curia leaked transcripts of a closed-door strategy session. Though the Vatican denied their authenticity, the language was eerily familiar. One line in particular set off a firestorm. Truth is not what happened, it is what is remembered. The phrase echoed across the digital realm like a curse. And then came the invitation, not from a church, not from the Vatican, but from a television network. They proposed a live debate. Karoline Leavitt versus Cardinal Mancini, the rising voice of Catholic traditionalism. A theological and moral reckoning on global broadcast. Ratings gold, ethically questionable, spiritually volatile, but undeniable in spectacle. Karoline didn't hesitate. She accepted. Her team exploded. The Pope hadn't spoken since the baptism, and now she was about to enter a public confrontation with one of his most hardline lieutenants. But Karoline was past the point of playing safe. If her faith was going to be judged, she wouldn't let the jury be whispers and headlines. She would face them, on their ground. The debate was scheduled for a Sunday evening. Prime time. A cathedral in Milan offered its massive nave as the venue, half church, half Colosseum. The setting was Gothic, and imposing stained glass casting fractured light across the floor, as if even heaven wasn't sure how to see her. Karoline wore deep navy, no cross, no campaign pin. Her only adornment was silence. Cardinal Mancini arrived draped in crimson, his robe trailing like the shadow of history itself. He was a man of precise words and sharpened pauses, with a smile that suggested pity more than warmth. This wasn't just about Karoline. This was about drawing a line between tradition and disruption. The moderator, flanked by marble angels, posed the opening question. Can one claim Christianity while once denying its value? Mancini struck first, his voice a smooth blade. He painted a picture of opportunism, of a woman who had worn the language of salvation as a mask, who had leveraged holy symbols for influence. He quoted scripture and doctrine, weaving them into a tapestry of accusation too elegant to be crude. Karoline let him speak. Let him build his case like a man setting fire to a field, unaware the wind was about to shift. When her turn came, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't quote scripture. Instead, she told a story of the girl she once was, the one with no belief, no trust, no compass, the one who had mocked what she didn't understand because it hurt less than admitting she needed it. She spoke of standing alone in the back of a church on a rainy night during college, after a personal loss she never named, watching a stranger kneel in prayer, and for the first time, envying not the ritual, but the peace in their face. She described reading the Bible not for knowledge, but for rescue, and she ended with a statement that landed like thunder. If perfection is the price of belief, then the church was never meant for people like me. But if redemption is real, then I stand here not as a fraud, but as its proof. The cathedral was silent. The audience, divided and suspicious when she walked in, now sat rapt. Even the cardinal's eyes narrowed, not in disdain, but calculation. She had turned his doctrine against him, not with defiance, but with sincerity. And sincerity, in an age of spin, was unpredictable. But before the moderator could shift the debate, a disruption. A figure in the back of the cathedral stood and shouted a phrase in Latin, ancient, forceful, almost liturgical. Cameras struggled to catch him, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Pope Francis. He had arrived without announcement, without ceremony, flanked only by 2 aides and the weight of his office. The crowd stood in stunned reverence. Even Mancini froze. Francis approached slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat. When he reached the altar, he didn't address the audience. He addressed Karoline. His tone was not fiery this time. It was quiet, but no less powerful. He spoke of belief not as a crown, but a wound, of how the church had, in many ways, forgotten its own sinners. He admitted, subtly and without apology, that perhaps his anger had been misplaced, that faith, in its truest form, does not always look like obedience. Then he turned to Mancini, and without raising his voice, he asked one question. If this woman is not of God, why then has her testimony moved the world more than our silence? The cardinal had no answer. The debate was over. But even as cameras cut and the world gasped, something darker stirred in the aftermath. Because far from the cathedral, in a private monastery nestled in the Apennine Mountains, a meeting had already begun. A group of powerful clergy, retired intelligence officers, and former political operatives, men and women who understood what influence looked like and how quickly it could spiral. Karoline Leavitt had become something neither the church nor the state had accounted for. Not a scandal, a symbol. And symbols, they knew, were far harder to bury than people. The monastery was no longer sacred. Not that night. Within its thick stone walls, shrouded by pine forests and veiled in secrecy, something ancient and calculating had taken root. The group gathered there, men cloaked in the legitimacy of titles long retired, others in the plain garb of unseen influence, weren't concerned with theology or public debate. They were concerned with preservation, of order, of power. And Karoline Leavitt had become a crack in the foundation they had sworn to protect. Her baptism had been a spark, her televised testimony, the gasoline, and the Pope's unexpected shift, a moment of humility on sacred ground, was the flame no one saw coming. Now the world had a heroine, not appointed, not anointed, chosen, in a sense more dangerous than holy, chosen by the people. The conclave in the monastery didn't speak in threats or rage. That wasn't their language. They spoke in plans, surgical, precise, reputational if possible, physical if necessary. Karoline had become a contagion, and if history had taught them anything, it was that the Church did not outlive revolutions by converting them. It outlived them by silencing them. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Karoline awoke in the early hours, still reeling from the night before. The Pope's appearance had upended everything. What was meant to be a showdown had turned into something larger, more intimate, more profound. She hadn't anticipated his presence. She hadn't dared hope for acknowledgement. But what he offered was more than that. It was a shift in posture, a recalibration of weight, not surrender, not alliance, something quieter, permission. But power doesn't give ground without punishment. By mid-morning, the first signs of retaliation surfaced. A report, released anonymously but echoed by major newsrooms, claimed Karoline's campaign had received undisclosed donations from fringe religious groups with extremist ties. There were no names, no amounts, just enough smoke to imply fire. She denied it publicly, swiftly, but the narrative machine was already moving. Investigations were launched. Old staffers were contacted. A former intern came forward claiming Karoline once told her that religion sells. The quote was vague, contextless, but it didn't matter. The doubt was planted. Even worse, a cyber breach occurred that same evening. Karoline's personal emails were hacked. Drafts of speeches, private journal entries, strategy memos, some real, others manipulated, began leaking online. In one, a sentence stood out, highlighted and framed across social media like a confession. People believe in God when they have nothing left. I just want to give them something to hold. It wasn't blasphemy, but it was spun that way, presented as proof that her faith was merely a political crutch, a tool crafted to manipulate despair. Her phone rang nonstop. Her team, fractured and sleep-deprived, fought to contain the fallout. She refused to hide. Instead, she walked the streets of Rome alone that night, hood up, face bare, slipping between churches like a ghost. The city no longer stared at her, like a visitor. It watched her like a warning. At the Vatican, Pope Francis remained conspicuously silent. No statements, no press appearances. Whispers grew louder. Some said he had been ordered by the Curia to step back. Others believed he had deliberately vanished, to observe how she would stand without his shadow. Either way, Karoline knew she was alone again. But this time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt sharpened. And then came the second letter. No seal, no sender. Delivered by hand to her hotel concierge and placed directly on her pillow. It was only one line. You are not Joan. You are Jezebel. Leave before you are made proof. Karoline stared at it for a long time. Not out of fear, but because she recognized the handwriting. It matched the first note, and that terrified her more than the words themselves. Somewhere in the maze of sacred halls and hidden loyalties, someone was watching her steps with a level of precision that no political opponent ever had. And they weren't trying to discredit her anymore. They were preparing to destroy her. The next day, a Vatican official known for his allegiance to Cardinal Mancini called an impromptu press conference. Cameras rolled as he condemned the hijacking of faith by political agendas, never naming Karoline outright, but referring to her baptism as a mockery of tradition. He demanded an inquiry, not into her beliefs, but into the Pope's decision to perform the baptism himself. That, he claimed, was the real scandal. Karoline watched it unfold from a monitor backstage. She had just been invited to speak at a global women's summit in Florence, a prior commitment made months ago, now rebranded by media as her counter-sermon. She didn't want to go, but she had to. When she stepped onto the stage, she no longer moved like a candidate. She moved like someone who'd been refined in fire. The crowd fell silent before she spoke. She didn't defend herself. She didn't address the leaks or the threats. Instead, she told the story of a girl she once saw on a subway. Young, trembling, with a bruised cheek and a cross around her neck. Karoline remembered watching that girl from across the car and thinking, "Why do you wear something that clearly didn't protect you?" Now, years later, she understood. The cross doesn't promise safety. It promises meaning. And when you carry it, not as a shield, but as a truth, it becomes dangerous. Not to you, but to those who fear what it represents. She ended the speech with a statement not of defiance, but prophecy. "I will not let your fear of belief make me doubt mine." The room erupted. But elsewhere, more quietly, a decision was made. In the monastery, the group convened once more. "She won't stop," said one of the elder members, his voice low, his eyes unblinking. "Then she must be stopped," came the reply. A name was whispered. A time. A place. Karoline had one more public appearance before returning to the United States. She would not be alone, but neither would they. The final appearance on her schedule was the Forum of Faith and Democracy, a high-security, invitation-only summit hosted in Geneva. An unlikely place for an American political figure to find herself, particularly one at the epicenter of a global theological firestorm, but the forum was symbolic. Neutral ground, a place where belief, politics, and philosophy were meant to coexist without hierarchy. Or at least, that was the illusion. Karoline's presence had transformed the event into an international spectacle. Her name now carried voltage. It hummed across every news feed, flared in every headline, whispered from both pulpits and podiums. Was she prophet or pretender? Victim or insurgent? The question no longer belonged to churches or state halls. It belonged to everyone. The Vatican issued a formal statement of non-attendance, but said nothing more. Pope Francis remained publicly silent. And yet, through every corridor of influence, a tension clung to the air, like smoke before a fire. Karoline arrived under heavy escort, private security, Swiss protection. Even her own team had ramped up protocols after a third anonymous letter had reached her Washington residence, this time with a chilling addition: a photo, grainy, taken from across the street. Karoline exiting a chapel. The implication was clear. The message wasn't "we're watching." It was "we're close enough to reach you." Still, she refused to back out. The forum was held in a cathedral-turned-convention space. The altar had been replaced by a stage, the pews by sleek rows of chairs and media scaffolding. But the stained glass still remained, casting the audience in fractured hues of ruby and gold. Karoline stood backstage, centered and still. She was tired, soul-tired, but calm. The fear had burned through her long ago, leaving only purpose in its place. Not righteousness, not vengeance, just clarity. Whatever they planned to do to her, they had already failed in the one thing that mattered: silencing her. She stepped onto the stage. The room quieted. Not out of courtesy, but anticipation. The world had seen her baptized. They had watched her withstand an international smear campaign, walk headfirst into confrontation with one of the most powerful religious figures alive, and emerge, not untouched, but unbroken. Now they expected fire, a final stand. But Karoline delivered neither. She spoke softly, not about herself, or even God, but about truth, about how truth isn't born in institutions, or bestowed by titles, or earned by lineage. It grows in the dark, in private battles, in doubt, in heartbreak. She spoke of the quiet moments when people feel abandoned by everything: faith, family, even themselves, and yet somehow still reach for something greater. That is belief, she said. Not certainty, but hunger. Not perfection, but persistence. The audience hung on every word. Then, just as she reached her final lines, the lights flickered. A low hum cut through the room. The audio feed glitched for a second. Then again. It wasn't technical error. It was interference. And Karoline knew. She didn't pause. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward, gripping the edge of the podium, her voice louder now, not defiant, but commanding. I know I am not what they expected. I know I'm not what they wanted. But belief was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to change things. The audience erupted in applause, but it was quickly muffled by movement. Two figures in plain clothes were spotted pushing their way through the crowd. One hand reached for a coat, another for something beneath it. Security reacted fast. A sharp crack rang out. Not a gunshot, but the sound of bodies colliding, metal hitting marble, and a scream from the back. Chaos surged forward like a wave. Karoline was shielded, pulled down by her guards, as the lights surged again, and then steadied. Seconds passed, then calm. Two men lay pinned to the floor, disarmed and restrained. Both carried Vatican credentials, fake as it turned out. The weapons? Concealed stun rods and blades, not guns. Designed for silence, not spectacle. No casualties. But the message was deafening. The cameras, still rolling, caught everything. The world watched not just an assassination attempt, but the resilience that followed. Karoline stood again, shaken, yes, pale, but unflinching. And she finished her speech. Not because it would be remembered, but because it was hers. No orchestrated act, no crafted campaign, just the truth. And in that moment, she became more than a symbol. She became real. The fallout was immediate. World leaders condemned the attack. Investigations launched. The attackers were identified as former members of an ultra-traditionalist order, excommunicated quietly years prior, but clearly still active, operating under the radar with funding no one could yet trace. Their stated motive, pulled from confiscated devices, was chilling in its simplicity. Preserve the sanctity of the Church. But it wasn't just their words that caught fire. It was what Karoline said the next day. She returned to the stage, not to relive the incident, but to dismantle it. They tried to protect God from me, she said. But God never asked for protection. Only honesty. That phrase, God never asked for protection, became a rallying cry. Within weeks, support surged. Not just for Karoline, but for the idea she had ignited. Young people across denominations shared their own complicated faith journeys. Women across the world spoke of how belief had shaped them in silence, without approval. Even within the Church, younger clergy began to speak more openly about reform, transparency, and the danger of fear disguised as tradition. The Vatican, cornered by its own silence, released a final statement. It did not apologize, but it acknowledged. Pope Francis, in a rare personal message broadcast from his residence, addressed the world not with authority, but humility. He thanked Karoline for reminding the Church that faith is not inherited, nor enforced. It is chosen, every day, by everyone, even, especially, those who were once lost. And then he said something no one expected, that he was stepping down, not in shame, but in renewal, to let the Church breathe again. Karoline returned to the U.S. weeks later. No grand arrival, no victory parade, just a quiet homecoming. She resumed her political work, but something in her had changed. Her voice was steadier. Her campaign no longer leaned on slogans or spectacle. It leaned on truth. In time, she stopped being the woman who stood against the Pope. She became the woman who reminded the world what belief really is. The attempted attack never defined her. It only sharpened her message, and in a world addicted to spectacle somehow, Karoline Leavitt made sincerity unstoppable. The cross she once wore as armor was now simply a part of her, not a symbol to wield, but a truth she lived. Not perfect, but real. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any institution ever prepared for.